The morning light cut through the Manhattan skyline like shards of glass, cold and unforgiving. Catherine Morgan stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office on the 42nd floor, watching the city wake beneath her. From this height, people looked like ants, small, insignificant, moving with purpose she couldn't quite remember feeling anymore. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass. Tailored charcoal suit, hair pulled back in a flawless chignon, diamond studs that cost more than most people earned in a year. At 38, she was the youngest CEO in the history of Morgan & Associates, a corporate conglomerate worth billions. She had everything, except she couldn't remember the last time she'd slept through the night. Ms. Morgan, the board meeting starts in 15 minutes. Her assistant Rachel's voice crackled through the intercom, professionally distant as always. Catherine didn't turn from the window. I'll be there in 10. She'd been standing there for 20 minutes already, though she'd never admit it. Standing there trying to remember why any of this mattered. The deals, the acquisitions, the quarterly reports that determined whether shareholders smiled or frowned. When had it all become so hollow? Her phone buzzed. Then again, and again. She ignored it, knowing it would be the same people it always was. Board members with concerns, investors with demands, competitors circling like sharks. Everyone wanted a piece of Catherine Morgan. No one wanted to know Catherine. The difference had stopped mattering years ago, or so she'd told herself. The boardroom was exactly as she'd left it yesterday. Sterile, expensive, filled with men in suits who smiled with their mouths, but never their eyes. Jonathan Pierce sat at the far end, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression unreadable. He'd been her father's closest friend, the man who'd helped her take control of the company when her father died 5 years ago. Lately, she'd caught him watching her differently, calculating. "Catherine, so glad you could join us." His tone was warm, but there was something underneath it, something sharp. She took her seat at the head of the table, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Let's begin." The next 2 hours were a masterclass in corporate warfare disguised as civil discussion. Revenue projections, expansion strategies, the proposed merger with Titanium Industries. Catherine parried every challenge, answered every question, made every decision with the cold precision that had built her reputation. But halfway through, Jonathan dropped the bomb. "There's been a concern raised by several board members about your recent decisions, Catherine. The Titanium merger specifically. Some feel you're being reckless." The room went silent. Catherine felt the shift immediately. The way eyes avoided hers, the subtle repositioning of bodies. They'd been talking about her, planning. Reckless? She kept her voice level, controlled. "I've increased company value by 42% in 3 years. Our stock is at an all-time high. But the Titanium deal carries significant risk," Jonathan continued, his voice almost fatherly. "Almost. We're merely suggesting that perhaps a more collaborative approach to major decisions might be prudent. Shared leadership, if you will." There it was. The coup, wrapped in concern and corporate speak. Catherine stood slowly, gathering her files. Every eye in the room locked onto her. "This meeting is adjourned. My office, Jonathan. Now." She didn't wait for a response, didn't look back as she walked out, but she felt it. The weight of their judgment, their greed, their betrayal. These men who'd smiled at her father's funeral and promised to support her. These men who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to their own ambitions. The confrontation with Jonathan was brief and brutal. He didn't deny it. The backroom conversations, the private meetings with other board members, the careful construction of a narrative that painted her as unstable, emotional, unfit to lead alone. "It's nothing personal, Catherine," he said, standing by her window with the same view she'd stared at that morning. "Your father would want what's best for the company. Don't you dare speak about my father." Her voice was ice. "Get out." He left without another word, and Catherine was alone again. Always alone. She worked until the building emptied, until the sounds of daytime business faded into the humming silence of night. Her eyes burned from staring at spreadsheets. Her neck ached from tension she couldn't release. The city lights below blurred together, and for a moment, just a moment, she wondered what would happen if she simply walked away from it all. But Catherine Morgan didn't walk away from anything. She won, or she destroyed herself trying. It was nearly midnight when she finally looked up from her computer, her vision swimming with exhaustion. The office was dark except for her desk lamp, casting long shadows across the expensive furniture that suddenly felt like props in someone else's life. That's when she heard it. The soft sound of a cleaning cart, wheels squeaking slightly against the marble floor outside her office. She'd seen janitors before, of course. They came and went like ghosts, invisible people who cleaned up after those who mattered. She'd never paid attention, never thought to. Why would she? But tonight, with her walls crumbling and her empire under siege, the simple human sound of someone else existing in this cold building struck her as almost absurd. The man appeared in her doorway, hesitating when he saw her still there. He was older than her, maybe mid-40s, with weathered hands and kind eyes that seemed out of place in this corporate tower. His uniform was clean but worn, and he carried himself with a quiet dignity that didn't match his position. "Sorry, ma'am, I can come back later." His voice was soft, respectful, with a slight accent she couldn't quite place. "No, it's fine." Catherine waved him in without really looking at him, returning her attention to her screen. "I'll be here a while anyway." She expected him to work quickly and leave. That's what they all did. Hurry through their tasks and disappear, afraid to bother the important people. But this man moved differently, deliberately, carefully, as if the act of cleaning held some meaning beyond simply removing dirt. Catherine found herself watching him from the corner of her eye, irritated by how his presence seemed to fill the room despite his attempts to be invisible. He was emptying her trash when he paused, looking at something. Catherine glanced over and saw what he'd noticed, a framed photo of her father that had somehow ended up in the trash. She must have knocked it off her desk during today's chaos. The janitor carefully retrieved it, wiping dust from the glass with gentle fingers. "Beautiful frame," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Must have been someone important. Catherine felt something crack in her chest. "My father." He looked up then, really looked at her for the first time, and his eyes held something she hadn't seen in years. Genuine compassion, free of agenda or judgment. "I'm sorry for your loss." He placed the photo carefully on her desk. Losing a parent. It changes the shape of the world. Makes everything feel a little colder, doesn't it? The simple truth of it hit Catherine like a physical blow. 5 years she'd been running this company. 5 years of people offering condolences that meant nothing. And this stranger, this janitor whose name she didn't even know, had just described exactly what she'd been feeling all along. "Yes," she whispered, and was horrified to feel tears threatening. Catherine Morgan didn't cry. Not in board meetings, not at funerals, not ever. The man nodded, understanding somehow that she needed silence more than sympathy. He continued his work, moving around her office with that same deliberate care, and Catherine found herself unable to return to her computer. Instead, she watched him, this invisible man who'd seen something in her that no one else had bothered to look for. He was nearly finished when he spoke again, his voice barely above a murmur. "You know what I learned after losing everything I cared about? The weight we carry. It's not meant to be lifted alone, but sometimes we get so used to the burden we forget what it feels like to set it down." Catherine stared at him. "What makes you think I've lost anything?" He smiled then, sad and knowing. "Because I recognize the look, ma'am. It's the same one I see in the mirror every morning." Before she could respond, he'd gathered his supplies and moved toward the door. "Good night, Miss Morgan. I hope tomorrow is kinder to you." And then he was gone, leaving Catherine alone in her office with her father's photo and a feeling she couldn't name. Something between anger and relief, between exposure and recognition. For the first time in 5 years, Catherine Morgan felt seen. She sat there for another hour, but she couldn't work, couldn't focus. The janitor's words kept echoing in her mind, simple and devastating in their truth. She'd built walls so high that even she couldn't see over them anymore. Convinced herself that isolation was strength, that needing no one made her powerful. But power, she was starting to realize, was just another word for alone. The city lights below still glittered, indifferent and beautiful. Somewhere down there, that janitor was probably moving through another office, another floor, invisible to everyone he served. And yet he'd carried more wisdom in a few quiet words than all her board members combined. Catherine picked up her father's photo, studying his face in the dim light. He'd built this empire from nothing, worked himself to death for it. She'd always thought honoring him meant continuing his work, being strong like he was, never showing weakness. But maybe she'd gotten it wrong. Maybe strength wasn't about standing alone at the top of a tower. Maybe it was about letting someone see you fall. Her phone buzzed again. Jonathan probably, or one of the other board members circling for her position. Catherine looked at it, then deliberately turned it face down on her desk. For the first time in years, what they wanted didn't matter as much as what she needed. And what she needed was to understand how a man who cleaned floors for a living could see what her billion-dollar empire had made invisible. Daniel Rivera's apartment was nothing like the gleaming towers of Manhattan he cleaned every night. It sat on the third floor of a modest building in Queens, where the subway rumbled beneath the streets and the smell of a dozen different cuisines mixed in the hallways. The paint was peeling in places, the radiator clanked through winter nights, but it was his, and after everything he'd lost, having something that was truly his meant more than most people could understand. He set his keys on the small table by the door, the same table his daughter had done her homework on years ago. The apartment was quiet now, had been for a long time, too quiet some nights. But Daniel had learned to live with silence, the way other people lived with noise. The photo on his bookshelf caught the morning light, a younger version of himself, smiling broadly, arms around a beautiful woman with kind eyes. Next to them, a little girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed grin. His family, his former life. Daniel touched the frame gently, a daily ritual. "Good morning, Sophia. Good morning, Maria." They didn't answer, of course. They'd been gone for 8 years now. Not dead. He reminded himself of that every day. Just gone. Living different lives in a different state with different last names. Protected by court orders and decisions Daniel had made when his world collapsed. He'd been someone else then. Daniel Rivera, owner of Rivera Construction, a growing company with 20 employees and contracts throughout New York. He'd had a house in the suburbs, 2 cars, plans for Maria's college fund. He'd been building something, reaching for the same American dream everyone chased. Then the recession hit. Contracts dried up overnight. Suppliers demanded payment he couldn't make. He'd taken loans, made promises, worked 20-hour days trying to save what he'd built. But some things, once they start falling, can't be caught. The bankruptcy was brutal. The investigation worse. There'd been accusations, fraud, mismanagement, things Daniel never did but couldn't prove he hadn't. His name was destroyed in the construction industry. His marriage, already strained by years of his absence and stress, shattered completely. Sophia had been 12 when her mother left, taking her to California for a fresh start. Away from the scandal, away from the reporters, away from him. The divorce papers had been clear. Supervised visitation only, pending investigation. By the time he was cleared of all charges 2 years later, Sophia was 14 and didn't want to see him anymore. Didn't want to know the father who'd let everything fall apart. He'd tried, called, wrote letters, sent birthday cards that came back unopened. But you can't force someone to forgive you. Can't make a child understand the impossible choices adults sometimes face. So Daniel had rebuilt what he could. Not a company or a reputation. Those were gone forever. Instead, he rebuilt himself, found peace in simplicity, wisdom in loss, dignity in work that others looked down on. He became invisible by choice this time, and in that invisibility, he'd learned to truly see. The morning routine was simple. Shower, coffee, toast with jam. Daniel read for an hour. Philosophy, mostly Marcus Aurelius and the Stoics, who understood that suffering could be transformed into strength. Then sleep, because his shift started at 8 p.m. and ran until 4 in the morning. But today, sleep wouldn't come. He kept thinking about the woman from last night, Catherine Morgan, CEO of the building's biggest tenant. He'd seen her before, of course, passed her in hallways 100 times. She'd never looked at him, never acknowledged his existence. Last night had been different. Something in her had been breaking, he'd seen it immediately. The same fractures he'd watched in his own mirror years ago. The moment when success stops meaning anything, and you realize you've built a prison instead of a palace. He shouldn't have spoken to her. Rule number 1 of janitorial work: be invisible. Don't engage, especially not with executives. But Daniel had stopped following rules that protected him at the expense of his humanity. He'd lost everything once trying to maintain appearances. Now he said what was true, even when, especially when, it was inconvenient. Something told him Catherine Morgan needed truth more than she needed another person pretending she was fine. That evening, Daniel arrived at Morgan Tower at his usual time. The lobby was empty except for security, the daytime chaos replaced by the peaceful quiet of night. This was his world now. The after hours, the in-between times when important people went home and invisible people kept everything running. He started on the 35th floor, working his way up as always. Offices, conference rooms, break rooms. Other cleaners worked different sections and they'd nod to each other in passing but rarely spoke. Everyone had their own stories, their own reasons for being here. Daniel respected that. By 11 p.m., he reached the executive floors. The 42nd floor where Catherine Morgan's office sat like a shrine to corporate power. He expected it to be dark, empty like it usually was, but light spilled from her doorway. Daniel hesitated. He could skip this office, come back later. But something made him push his cart forward, that same instinct that had made him speak last night. Catherine was at her desk again, but this time she looked up when he appeared. Really looked, with eyes that held recognition. "You're here late again, ma'am," Daniel said quietly, beginning his routine. "So are you." Her voice was different tonight, less sharp, more uncertain. "Every night?" "Every night." He emptied the trash, replaced the liner. "Someone has to keep the world clean for the important people." She flinched at that, and Daniel wondered if he'd overstepped. But then she surprised him. "What's your name?" In 5 years of working this building, no executive had ever asked him that. Daniel Rivera. "I'm Catherine." She paused. "But you already knew that." "Yes, ma'am. Just Catherine, please." She stood, moving to the window where she seemed to spend so much time. "Can I ask you something, Daniel?" "Of course. Last night you said you'd lost everything you cared about. What did you mean?" Daniel stopped working, considering whether to answer. The old him would have deflected, maintained professional distance. But the old him had also lost everything by hiding behind walls. "I had a business once, a family, a house in Westchester with a yard where my daughter played." He kept his voice steady, factual. "The economy crashed, and I crashed with it. Made mistakes trying to save what couldn't be saved. By the time the dust settled, my wife was gone. My daughter didn't want to know me, and my name was worthless in the only industry I'd ever known." Catherine turned from the window, her expression unreadable. "I'm sorry. Don't be. It taught me what actually matters." Daniel returned to his work, but slowly, knowing somehow that this conversation needed to happen. When you have everything, you never question whether it's real. When you lose it all, you learn what was solid and what was just smoke. And what was solid? Her voice was barely above a whisper. "The man I chose to be after everything fell apart. That was solid. Everything else, the success, the respect, the appearance of having it all together, that was smoke." Catherine sank into her chair, and Daniel saw something in her face he recognized intimately. The moment when someone realizes they've been living a lie, even a comfortable one. "They're trying to take my company," she said suddenly. "People I trusted, people my father trusted. They're staging a coup, questioning my competence, my decisions. Everything I've built." "Might be smoke," Daniel finished gently. She looked at him sharply but without anger. "How can you say that? You don't know what I've sacrificed, what this company means." "You're right. I don't know your specific sacrifices, but I know the look of someone who's built a fortress instead of a life." He met her gaze steadily. "I know because I did the same thing. Worked myself to death for a business that couldn't love me back, ignored a wife who could, missed my daughter growing up for meetings that don't matter anymore. So what should I do? Just give up? Let them win? I'm not saying that." Daniel moved closer, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm saying maybe the question isn't how to win. Maybe it's what winning actually means. Is it keeping the title, the office, the power? Or is it keeping yourself?" Catherine stared at him for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, tears began sliding down her face. Not dramatic crying, just quiet tears that seemed to surprise her as much as they surprised him. "I don't know who I am without this," she whispered. "I've been Catherine Morgan, CEO, for so long. I've been my father's daughter, the youngest executive, the woman who proved everyone wrong. But Catherine, just Catherine, I don't know who that is anymore." Daniel did something then that could get him fired. He pulled up a chair and sat across from her, treating her not as his employer but as a human being in pain. "Then maybe it's time to find out," he said quietly. "Because the woman behind all those titles, she's the one who's been crying for help that no one else could hear. She's the one I saw last night and the one I see right now, and she seems worth knowing." They talked until 2 in the morning. Catherine told him about her father, the pressure of living up to his legacy, the loneliness of being surrounded by people who wanted something from her, but never wanted to know her. Daniel shared more of his story, the legal battles, the supervised visits with Sophia that became more painful than healing, the decision to finally let go because holding on was hurting everyone. "Do you ever see her?" Catherine asked. "Your daughter?" "No, She's 20 now, in college. Has a life that doesn't include me. The old pain was still there, but Daniel had learned to carry it differently. I send her a card on her birthday every year. Let her know I'm here if she ever wants to reach out. That's all I can do. That must be incredibly hard. It is. But it's also taught me something important. Love isn't about possession or proximity. Sometimes love is giving someone the space to heal, even when it means you heal alone. Catherine was quiet for a moment. The board wants me to step down. Share leadership, they call it, but we both know what it really means. Part of me wants to fight them with everything I have, but another part wonders if they might be right, Daniel offered. Not about my competence. I know I'm good at what I do, but about whether this is what I should be doing at all. She laughed, but it was hollow. 5 years of running this company, and I've never once asked myself if I actually want to. That's a question only you can answer. But here's what I know. The things we think define us usually don't. When everything fell apart, I thought I was nothing without my business. Turned out, I was more myself without it than I ever was with it. Daniel stood, gathering his supplies. It was late, and he still had 3 floors to finish. But something had shifted tonight. Something fragile and important. Catherine stood too. Thank you, Daniel, for seeing me. For being honest. Thank you for listening. He paused at the door. You know what the hardest part of my fall was? Not the bankruptcy or the divorce or even losing Sophia. It was admitting that I'd been wrong about what mattered. Once I did that, everything else got easier. I'm not sure I'm ready for that, Catherine admitted. Most people aren't. But you're asking the questions, and that's where change starts. He smiled, the same gentle smile she'd noticed their first night. Good night, Catherine. I hope tomorrow brings you clarity. After he left, Catherine sat in the quiet of her office, feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Not happiness, not relief, but something simpler and more profound. The possibility that she could be someone different than who she'd always been. The next evening, Daniel wasn't surprised to find Catherine's office occupied again. This time, though, she had 2 cups of coffee waiting. I didn't know how you take it, she said, almost shy. So I got it black. Black is perfect. Daniel accepted the cup, a simple gesture that meant more than she probably realized. Executives didn't buy coffee for janitors, but Catherine was learning to see past titles. They fell into a pattern over the following weeks. Daniel would arrive at her office around 11, and they'd talk while he worked. Sometimes about the corporate crisis that was intensifying, board meetings that became battlegrounds, allies who revealed themselves as enemies. Sometimes about deeper things, what they'd wanted to be as children before the world taught them what they should want instead. Catherine learned that Daniel had wanted to be a teacher once, that he loved poetry, but had convinced himself it was impractical, that he'd learned to find joy in small things. A perfect sunset, a good book, the satisfaction of a floor cleaned so well you could see your reflection. Daniel learned that Catherine had never wanted to run her father's company, that she'd dreamed of being an architect, designing spaces where people could feel at home, that she'd sacrificed that dream because her father needed her, and then he died before she could tell him she'd wanted something different. Do you resent him? Daniel asked one night. Your father? Catherine considered the question carefully. I did for a while, but I'm starting to understand that he didn't force me into this. I chose it because I was afraid to choose myself. That's not his fault. It's mine. The first step to freedom is accepting responsibility for our cages, Daniel said, even the ones built from love. Other people started noticing. Rachel, her assistant, commented on how different Catherine seemed. Calmer, more present. Board members noted that she'd stopped working around the clock, that she seemed less invested in their power games. Some saw it as weakness, others as unpredictability. Jonathan Pierce, sensing an opportunity, accelerated his plans. He called an emergency board meeting presenting evidence of Catherine's erratic behavior and lack of focus. He had allies now, people who'd grown tired of working under a woman, who saw her inheritance as theft of what should have been theirs. Catherine sat through the ambush with surprising calm. The old her would have fought back with facts and fury. Instead, she listened, really listened, to what they were saying beneath their corporate language. They were afraid of change, of losing control, of a world that didn't center them anymore. You're right, she said when they finished. The room went silent. I have been different lately, more distracted, less focused on quarterly projections and market share. Do you know why? She stood looking at each board member in turn. Because I've been asking myself a question I should have asked 5 years ago. What am I building this for? My father built this company to provide for his family, to create something lasting. I've been maintaining it because I was afraid to admit I don't want it. Jonathan leaned forward, smelling blood. So you're admitting you're not fit to lead? I'm admitting that I've been leading from fear instead of vision. And that needs to change. Catherine smiled, and it was the freest she'd felt in years. So here's what's going to happen. I'm restructuring the company, promoting people who care about the work, not just the profit, implementing policies that value employees at every level. And yes, Jonathan, I'm stepping back from day-to-day operations. Murmurs of victory around the table, quickly silenced when she continued. But not to share power with any of you. To build something that actually matters. Affordable housing projects, community development, spaces designed for people, not profit margins. This company will fund it, and I'll lead it. Anyone who doesn't like it can sell their shares. The room erupted. Jonathan's face went red with rage. Your father would be ashamed. No, Catherine said quietly. I think he'd be relieved that I finally found the courage to be myself. Daniel was mopping the lobby when Catherine found him at 3 a.m. She was still in her business suit, but her hair was down and she was smiling. Really smiling. For the first time since he'd met her. I did it, she said. I'm not giving them the company, but I'm not letting it own me anymore either. I'm proud of you. And Daniel meant it. He'd watched her transform over these weeks from a woman drowning in expectations to someone learning to swim. I couldn't have done it without you. Catherine hesitated, then continued. You helped me see that who I am isn't what I do, that there's a difference between success and fulfillment. You did the hard work yourself. I just held up a mirror. They stood in the quiet lobby, an unlikely pair bound by understanding rather than circumstance. Around them, the building hummed with the machinery of commerce, the gears of empire. But here, in this small moment, two people had found something more valuable than power or position. They'd found recognition, the kind that sees past surfaces to the struggling, hoping human heart beneath. What happens now? Daniel asked. Catherine looked toward the windows, where dawn was beginning to paint the sky in shades of gold. Now I build something real, something that helps people instead of just accumulating wealth. It'll be smaller, harder, less impressive on paper, but it'll be mine, truly mine. That sounds like a good beginning. And you? She turned to him. What's your beginning? Daniel thought about Sophia, about the birthday card he'd send next month that might or might not be read, about his small apartment and simple life, about the peace he'd found in letting go of who he'd tried to be. I think I'm already living it. Some beginnings look like endings from the outside. Took me a long time to learn the difference. As the sun rose over Manhattan, they stood together, the janitor and the CEO who was learning to be just Catherine. Two people who'd lost everything and found something more valuable in the wreckage. The courage to be seen, exactly as they were. The world would judge them. People would whisper about the powerful woman who'd lost her edge, who spent her nights talking to the help. They'd question her decisions, her sanity, her worth. But Catherine had learned from the man who cleaned her floors that the opinions of people who didn't truly see you were just noise. And noise, no matter how loud, couldn't drown out the quiet truth of a life finally lived with purpose. Thank you, Daniel, she said softly, for being invisible long enough to see what everyone else missed. Thank you, Catherine, he replied, for looking. 6 months later, the community center stood in Brooklyn, far from Manhattan's glass towers. Catherine ran her fingers along the blueprints spread across the table, affordable housing units designed with care, not just efficiency. Her architecture degree, dormant for 15 years, finally had purpose. Daniel appeared in the doorway, no longer in a janitor's uniform, but worn jeans and a paint-stained shirt. He'd accepted her offer to help manage the project, bringing his construction expertise back to life. The courtyard's finished, he said, smiling. You should see it. They walked outside together, where families were already gathering in the green space Catherine had designed. Children played, neighbors talked, life bloomed in concrete that had been forgotten. Catherine's phone buzzed, a message from Rachel, now running Morgan & Associates with the board Catherine had rebuilt. The company was smaller but stronger, profitable and purposeful. Another message appeared. Daniel's breath caught. It's Sophia, he whispered, showing Catherine the screen. Dad, I'm ready to talk. Can we meet? Catherine squeezed his hand as tears filled his eyes. Some losses could heal. Some distances could close. They'd both learned that the people who seem to have everything are often the ones who've lost themselves, and sometimes being truly seen is worth more than being universally admired. Sometimes, the invisible ones see clearest of all.